بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Welcome to another night of the Hadith softeners, the Hadiths from the Kitab al-Riqaq of Imam al-Tabrizi's Mishkat al-Musabih. Alhamdulillah, we are in the first section of a new chapter, a new sub-chapter called Fadl al-Fuqara, the virtues of the poor and the lifestyle of the Prophet, peace be upon him. We read the first two hadiths, which were amazing hadiths from Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. And the next two or three hadiths that are going to come are speaking about the place of the poor in the hereafter. So, as we said before, the Prophet ﷺ is giving these hadiths and talking about the status of the poor vis-a-vis those who have money. And the reason why Imam Tabrizi brings these as heart softeners is because, well, number one, for us to reflect on our own state and see where we are vis-a-vis the dunya, right? We already understand how the dunya is like this and like that, but in our lifestyle, in our social status, where we are, and are we among those who have to be patient and be patient with our situation, or are we with those who have been blessed with more, and we should be helping those who have to be patient with their situation? And so, in either case, no matter where we are, there's something there that needs to be done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to soften our hearts. In the next hadith, the Prophet ﷺ speaks about Jannah, and it's important to remember that there is, given modern sensitivities around certain subjects, right, such as gender and feminism and stuff like that. I just want to bring this up front, kind of as a trigger warning, that sometimes when people hear these hadiths, the shaitan and the kind of modern misinterpretations of these concepts can actually cause one, rather than softening one's heart, it could make one's heart harder if they don't apply the correct context and understanding. So let's go through this and let's talk about what it means, inshallah. وعن أسامة بن زيد رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قمت على باب الجنة فكان عامة من دخلها المساكين وأصحاب الجد محبوسون غير أن أصحاب النار قد أمر بهم إلى النار وقمت على باب النار فإذا عامة من دخلها النساء متفق عليه. Usama ibn Zayd, may peace be radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him, narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I stood at the gates of paradise. I stood at the gate of paradise, and the generality of those who entered it were the poor, were the downtrodden, and the people of means, the owners of means, the people of wealth and power, were detained, mahbusun. But those who were destined for hellfire had been commanded to go to the hellfire. And I stood at the gates of the hellfire, and behold, the generality of those who entered it were women. And this is agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim, right? And we'll read the next narration as well, and we'll translate it, and we'll talk about the context and understanding. وعن ابن عباس رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اطلعت في الجنة فرأيت أكثر أهلها الفقراء واطلعت على النار فرأيت أكثر أهلها النساء متفق عليه. Ibn Abbas narrates رضي الله عنه that the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, said, I looked into paradise and I saw that most of its dwellers were the poor, and I looked into the hellfire and I saw that the majority of its dwellers were women. This was agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim as well. So let's talk about what the context is. First of all, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, "Qumtu ala bab al-Jannah." I was standing at the gates of paradise. We know one thing, that this is a future event, right? The idea of people entering paradise or entering hellfire, judgment, these things is, chronologically speaking, it's something that hasn't happened yet. Of course, in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His ability to show something to any servant that He wishes, time is not of essence, and time is not of consequence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he can make His Prophet ﷺ see something that's going to happen in the future as if it's happening now. In one sense, in the ilm of Allah, to Allah, because Allah is not exposed to time and living in time and subject to time the way that we are chronologically, it's all the same to Him. So this existing in the past or in the future is not something that is different to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah doesn't experience time in that respect. So what's happening here is really a glimpse of what is coming up, right? And it also, the ulama have disagreed, or they've mentioned a number of interpretations about what it means to be standing at the gate of paradise. Some ulama, they say it was on the night of Isra wa Mi'raj, the night journey and ascension that took place, where the Prophet ﷺ was given a vision of certain things as he was going through the heavens, the seven heavens, after his trip to Jerusalem. Others say that it was in a dream state. Others say that it was through kashf, meaning spiritual unveiling, where a vision is given to the Prophet ﷺ through revelation. And this can also occur to other people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, like for example a spiritual vision, but that's not the actual physical reality. And also there has been an interpretation that ittala'tu here means bit-ta'ammul wa bil-fikr, that I was thinking about it, or ra'aytu means I thought about it, or I was reflecting on it, and this is what I saw in my reflection. So it could mean any of those interpretive possibilities, right? And it's always good to give the different possibilities that the ulama speak about, because it allows us a broader picture of how to look at a certain hadith. Whereas if we limit it to one translation only, then we come across with only one rigid way of looking at it. So I'm going to give the different possibilities. And then the Prophet ﷺ in the first hadith says, and the generality of people, the ammatun nas, like ammatul people, like generally this is what I saw. And the other says that the majority of people. Now, the majority of people, we're going to get to the second part after the first part, obviously, although the second part is often what can disturb people or bother people. So we're going to talk about the first part, which is what Imam Tabrizi brings this hadith for, which is that the generality of people entering the paradise were the poor. And it's because, of course, because they did not get things in this world, as much of the dunya, the number of sins that could be committed and the taint that excessive wealth brings and the corruption that it brings as well, they weren't subject to that. It's important that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the author of Fath al-Bari, a commentary of Sahih al-Bukhari, says that this is not an entrance due to poverty. So it's not because they're poor that they're entering Jannah. This is not it. But it's rather because of the righteousness that came along with them not having as much. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them that. Otherwise, wealth and poverty itself is not a means into paradise or hellfire. It's rather what comes along with that. So if somebody could be doing wrong while they're in a poor state, it doesn't mean that they're better than someone who is rich and righteous, for example. Actually, it doesn't even mean that someone who's poor and someone who is wealthy, someone who's poor and righteous is necessarily better than someone who is righteous and wealthy. What it means here is that it depends on how that state causes them to behave. And so, as a type of, as well, an encouragement to the rest of us to treat the poor well, to honor them, to not look down on them, and to give them their rights, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing the Prophet ﷺ their rank in the next life. So this is important to know. The next thing is, and what does it mean by the downtrodden? The masakin. Fuqara is like poor, masakin is generally downtrodden. It means in poor and weak, in money and in strength. So it could also mean those people who are downtrodden, those people of the exploited classes of society, the underprivileged, the disadvantaged. In any society, it could change. It could mean the orphans in some societies. It could mean women in some societies, in certain people of color in some societies, or and other people of differing abilities in some times and places. But what it means that people that did not have an advantage in their time vis-a-vis other people in their society. So the majority of those people are the poor, right? And also because they have now, the next thing the Prophet ﷺ mentions is that the people of means, meaning wealth and power, ashabul al-jad, those people are actually detained. And the reason why they were being detained is because they have a longer questioning. So if someone has a certain amount of wealth, they'll be questioned about that. Or worldly activity, could be prestige, pride, influence over other people. What did you do with that influence? What did you do with the power that Allah gave you? Authority. Now, the people who have those means, it's different because they have a lot of things to answer about. Every single piece of wealth, they have to account for it. Every single time they told someone to do something else, got someone else in trouble, exercised their influence and authority, they'll have to be answering for that. So they will be detained. In the next hadith, we'll see the difference that comes about because of that. So they'll be right there, standing in that place, and it is a type of a trial and a test and a punishment to just be standing in a place with suspense as to what Allah will bring about, and to have to answer for everything. Just imagine when we'll have to answer for every single dollar and cent that we, or pound and pence or whatever, different currencies, whatever little bit you spent, you'll have to answer for all of that. Then, and parents as well, we have to watch out for that. Then the people of the hellfire were sent forth. They had already been condemned and sent forth. Now, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, then I stood at the gate of paradise while I looked into it, whether this is a literal or whether this is in a dream state or whether it's in a spiritual unveiling or whether it's through thought. The point is that there's some vision happening and there's some sort of assessment. Now the Prophet is saying the generality of that he saw were women. Let's understand the context first of all. First of all, the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning this not to put anyone down, of course. Rather, he came to lift up the status of those who were downtrodden. And for men and women, he put them on the same spiritual level. This is what Islam did, right? Not only in a worldly level of respect and of honor and of status, but also in a spiritual level, put men and women on an equal footing. So, for example, in other religions or other cultures, when menstruating women were cast out and they were basically ostracized, not allowed to eat with their husbands, not allowed to live sleep in the same beds, for example, let alone hugging and kissing and these types of things. The Prophet ﷺ was the one who said, no, they're your equal companions. They are your equal halves, right? And he set the example, for example, by there are hadiths that tell us where his wives were menstruating and he would actually hug them and cuddle up with them to show that there's nothing wrong with that. Eat with them, right? For example. And there are many other ways in which the Prophet ﷺ gave choice to women, gave agency to women, and gave them rights. Now, what's being said here is in the context of advice to women. Okay, it's not something to put anyone down. It's something to say that there's something that you have to look out for as well. Why? Interestingly, it's not because women are the ones who will be more likely to do this. No, but people of wealth and power overwhelmingly are who? Even in our time, they're men. Right? When you look at the tyrants, the dictators, the corporate, corporate thieves, things like this. People people in drugs, people in all kinds of illegal activities, people who exploit others, slave trade, all types of things. Most of those people are men. Let's be honest. The most heinous crimes that are committed, the grossest crimes that are committed, are men in most of our times. So, if someone thought in that time. That perhaps it is that the men will be the only one responsible because they're the only ones with the dunya in their hands at that time, then perhaps someone would think that women have no accountability in that regard. So the Prophet ﷺ is now advising his sisters, advising the women of the ummah, that there's something that you have to look out for as well. And this has been shown to me. The Prophet ﷺ is not saying, this is how I wanted it to be, this is how I hoped it would. No, astaghfirullah, not at all. So to put that as some, Islamophobes and, polemical missionaries have done, to try to put that in the court of the Prophet ﷺ would be wrong. He's just saying, I looked into this, I'm concerned. And what it's to say is that there are still aspects of dunya that our sisters and our mothers and our daughters have to look out for, just like how men have to look out for. And just like we can't conclude and say, oh, men are the only ones who have done everything wrong, he's kind of speaking to women, and he's giving them what they need to know about their betterment in the next life. And this is out of concern and love that the Prophet ﷺ had for the women of the ummah. And it's like, for example, someone saying, giving a talk to youth, right, who are, let's say, at an age where they're at risk of falling into different activities, saying, I actually visited a jail, and it's full of and the majority of it are young men. In this case, that would not be saying that young men somehow have something inside them that the majority of young men, for example, are in jail. That would be wrong. That would logically not be consistent. Or to say that something about being a young male or a male has something to do with going to jail. That would not be the thing. It's an occasion that you would use to observe, to advise. Same thing, I looked inside the hospital, and the majority I saw were elderly people. And you're advising your parents, like, please don't go out in the time of the COVID crisis. Please, follow these rules. It's hitting these. It doesn't mean that being old necessarily means that you are not going to take the means, or that that you deserve to be in a hospital or something like that. So just remember something. We've been exposed to a lot of smear campaigns, a lot of polemical stuff. There's a lot of what you call on the internet, what you call doubt porn, where people are attacking Islam through these things. And anytime women are mentioned, even when it's out of the Prophet ﷺ's concern for women, they're twisting it in such a way. So a lot of Muslims, brothers and sisters, have gotten doubts because of this. So it's something to clear right from the get-go. And the other thing is that the ulama say something very interesting. It could be said that the Prophet ﷺ at a glance, remember, I just looked in. It didn't say I did a census of the hellfire. I looked into it. And this is at a time right in the beginning. This is how it looked. And then the ulama say that this was only because of some sins that had to be forgiven and done away with, and then that after the intercession, or after some time, the women were actually they left the hellfire, and then they went over to Jannah, and they became the majority of the people in Jannah. So, for example, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, the number one narrator of hadith in the Islamic tradition, He says his opinion was that Jannah was majority of people in heaven, in paradise, were women, right? And there are hadiths that back that up as well. And there are other commentators as well in the hadiths that say, no, the majority of people in hell does not mean that the majority of, it'll be a minority of people in heaven. And there, even if there are hadiths that say that there's a minority of women, it doesn't mean always. It means that this was the situation then at one point, and at another point they transferred over. Now let's look at it this way logically as well. We know as well that people will enter hellfire, and that if they have belief in their hearts, for their misdeeds they may only stay there for some time, and then they'll be taken out and put forever. The believing members of the ummah, they'll be put forever into paradise. So what it tells you is that those women who were there, the Prophet ﷺ saw, first of all, it's through intercession, and they were brought out. So it means that the ones who were left behind, they were no longer the majority left behind. The majority were men. And the majority, if they remained behind, it means they did things that were much worse than them. So in reality, if you look at the comparison, it's saying, yes, they're there. So just don't think that they're not going to be there. They still have things to be responsible for. But they're not the majority of those who will ever be everlasting there. There are other hadiths that go to say, in Tirmidhi, it's narrated, that there will be women, a surplus of women whose husbands were sent to hellfire, and they were sent to heaven. So they will get husbands in heaven, where their husbands will not join them from hellfire. So there'll be a surplus of women in that sense, because their husbands won't join them over. So this idea is something to watch out for. As well, there's another interpretation that was given, that it could mean that this doesn't mean that the majority of women will be in hellfire, right? But only those that were actually there. So it could be talking about within the population of women itself. And so at the end, the majority of women are in paradise. So this is something to be wary of and to understand. And there's also a heart softening aspect here as well, that there are things that appeal to everyone, every gender, every type of person, about their leaning towards the dunya. And the exploitation of women had been happening back then. The objectification of women had been happening back then and before that, and up to now, and will be happening tomorrow as well. And the Prophet ﷺ is just giving us that indication as well. There are certain ways that the dunya will try to make women lean towards the dunya, right? Other than, let's say, power and tyranny and corporate greed, as it was back then. And so we should watch out for that as well. So alhamdulillah. So then the next hadith, وعن Abdullah ibn Amr radiallahu anhu says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الفقراء المهاجرين يسبقون الأغنياء يوم القيامة إلى الجنة ب40 خريفا. رواه Muslim. That it is said, Abdullah ibn Amr narrates radiallahu anhu, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, verily, indeed, the poor of the immigrants, will precede the rich on the day of judgment to paradise by 40 years. It's actually, the word used is kharif, and this is narrated by Imam Muslim. 40 kharif, it means fall, between summer or autumn, 40 autumns. And this is a metaphor for saying 40 years. And what this means is that the poor immigrants, subhanAllah, so this idea of migration and the idea of refugees and the idea of moving from place to place and poverty being attached to that is a perennial theme in the history of mankind. It applied back then, it applies today as well. But the Prophet ﷺ is saying that those people will be proceeding into paradise 40 years before the rich. And we're talking about the rich who will enter paradise, not the rich who will be judged. The rich who will enter paradise. Why? Because they have less to account for. Why? Because they had less to distract them. They were able to focus more. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we're not among the poor immigrants, right? The early people who migrated for the sake of Islam from Mecca to Medina, and those who follow in their footsteps until the day of judgment. If we're among that crowd, do not be proud. Thank Allah and continue to have patience and have shukr for how Allah has made it easy for you to focus on the hereafter and Him. And if we are not among that crowd, if we are among those who are wealthier, then we should be in the khidmah of those people. We should be in the nusra of those people. The Medinan helpers were called the Ansar because they helped the poor immigrants. So we should be in the service of those people who are in that situation. And by that way, we level out the opportunities of pleasing Allah that were given to those people, right? But just to sit back and say we have and you have not, and so therefore I'm going to enjoy myself and not do anything for you, that's where you're going to be accounted for. And there are other hadiths that say that the distance will be that the delay will be of 500 years and not 40 years. So there are differences of opinion as well that we're going to get to why that's the case. And it also tells us that we don't understand exactly how time is measured in the hereafter, but there are different opinions. But the point is to say that it's a long stretch of time, right? Sometimes the Arabs would use terms 70, 40 to say it's going to be a long stretch of time. So this is we're gonna end with that here. We had 3 hadiths. We had to we would have sailed through the first 2 hadiths, but the reason is because I wanted to clarify those things, because there's no point in talking about a heart softener and then the shaitan puts a doubt into someone's heart and then they go read about it somewhere else, and then rather than heart softening, it becomes heart hardening. And instead we should realize the Prophet ﷺ loves us more than we love ourselves. He lived, he shed his blood, sweat and tears, and he would stay up all night crying to get this message to us for our betterment. He imparted this wisdom on us for us to watch out for how the dunya could attack us. So let's not get sidetracked into the agenda of other people, and let's realize the Prophet ﷺ is telling every single one of us, no matter where we are in life, that what to look out for, and that he is there in the end to help us get into paradise. This is another very important thing. At the end of the day, he will be the one, and we'll talk about that towards the end. In fact, Imam Bukhari finishes his heart softeners with this hadith, and we'll talk about that the Prophet ﷺ is actually going to be there all the way to help us through our difficulties in the hereafter, and he's giving us advice on how to do that while he's not here with us in our lives. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us towards what will soften our hearts towards him, and understand the wisdom of what's being said, and safeguard our hearts from those things that will harden it, or to turn it sour, or to turn it away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروا إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. اللهم اجعلنا من الواصلين إلى العين دون سامعين للأثر. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.